Okay, good morning everyone and a warm welcome to what I thought was going to be the first seminar here at Sverige i världen, but of course you were early birds and had already started. My name is Petra Tötterman-Andorf and I am the Secretary General of the Kvinna Foundation. And before we get started on the topic, I would like to draw all of your attention to the empty chair that's on the other side of the stage, and that is for RFSL, who is not here in Almedalen. So I was glancing through the very thick catalog of all of the about 4,000 seminars that are going on in Almedalen this week. And I found quite a few actually that were covering the same topics as we are here today, looking at gender equality and looking at the presence or the non-presence of women in different settings, from boardrooms to managerial positions. And it is a topic that is very current and it's very important. And what we will focus on today is looking at the importance of women at the peace table and in peace building. And we have an extremely prominent panel, and going all the way from over there, it's Linda Sell, who is the Deputy Head of Communication at Kvinna, and who used to be our regional manager in the MENA region. And we have Annika Söder, who is the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs in Sweden. And we have Annick Wibben, who is the first in history ever Anna Lindh Professor of Gender, Peace and Security at the Swedish Defense University. And we're extremely happy that the three of you could join us here this morning for this topic. And we have a tight schedule and we would like to have room for some questions or reflections from you in the audience at the end. So I think that I'm just going to dive in and let you, Annick, start. Yeah.
Happening?
No.
It will happen.
No.
Is it on?
Okay.
Is it on now? Yes.
There you are.
Excellent.
Welcome.
Okay. So the question we were asked, the question of the seminar, more peace with women at the table. I am supposed to give you the academic perspective. And the academic perspective in so many cases, and today as well, is yes, of course, but because the research on this topic is quite promising, meaning what we do know seems to point in the direction that it does matter what if we have women at the peace table. The problem is that we have so few processes, peace processes, where women are at the table, that we don't really have enough data to fully make this claim. So we have sort of a chicken and egg problem here, where we just need more women at the peace table so we can do better research on what it means to have women at the peace table. Okay, so with that caveat, what we are learning about this issue is that what we need to pay attention to, besides just having women at the peace table, is what are they doing when they're there? Who are the women that we are including? Who do they represent? It's not really enough to just have one woman, obviously, right? If women are 50% of the population, we sort of need to have somewhat equal presentation there. So what we also need to take into account when we think about this is that one of the things that actually makes it even more important for women to be at the table is that the peace processes themselves are changing. So it's no longer just simplistically maybe about, or it's not really simple even that, but it's no longer just about ceasefires and sort of dividing territory and ending the violence, but a lot of the time what we see in sort of modern day peace processes is much more complicated. It's about the long road ahead, right? About creating the foundations and structures for peace going forward. And so this more complicated long-term arrangement needs to have a much broader representation of women in these processes. But it also means that there are more opportunities to include women. So one of the things that I think is important to point out is that when we talk about women in peace processes, we're not just talking about women as negotiators or mediators in the very specific process of formulating that peace, but they might have observer status, they might be part of commissions or in consultative roles as experts. They might be involved sort of putting pressure on the process from the outside. So this is something that if you look at the Liberian peace process, for example, you had both women who were part of the negotiations and you had other women's movements who were pressuring from the outside. So you have sort of multiple roles that women can take. And I think one of the things to do for research purposes as well is to pay attention to all of this. One of the really important caveats, again, so, professors, we have caveats, so is that we need to make sure not to essentialize women, meaning that it's not just about, sort of the person with the body of what we identify as a woman, but really to understand that part of the thing that they bring to the peace process is their social positioning. So the ways in which, in particular societies, women will have particular roles. Often, they might be primarily responsible for household issues and the welfare of others. And so in that sense, they bring to the table important aspects that might otherwise get lost if we have a very militarized process, for example, where we also only include the belligerents. So they have a different insight into what happens on the ground, and that is connected to their gender, but it's really more about the social positioning, which then also leads me to remind everybody that gender intersects with race and class and religion and so forth. Having just talked to women from Syria last week in Brussels, right? If we look, we can't really talk about Syrian women as a single category because within Syria we have many different groups. The Kurdish situation in the north is very different from the rest of the country. The other thing, of course, here is the question of do we include LGBTQIA groups in here who are often specifically targeted at processes of transition. So the question then, and I'm good, okay, is really the how. How do we include women, and how do we have a sort of a level of what is called meaningful participation, right? Which of course is also a big aspect of the Swedish foreign policy. So according to the research we have so far, which as I mentioned is somewhat limited, their participation is positive if they have a say in how the process itself works, right? So if they have some sort of input in what gets discussed and who gets included and so forth. Actually, let's say it's not only positive, but it's the most positive when women are included in that way. We also actually find from the research that even if women are just included, without necessarily having that sort of fuller role, it still makes a difference in the process. They often are able to get parties back to the table if they sort of negotiations are stalled. They often will sort of say, no, we really need to address these kind of root causes of the conflict. And we actually have found, and this is really important, that including women does not produce negative effects. Okay, so this is really important. So because often there is a sort of, right, oh, it's too hard, and who should we include? And the belligerents, they don't want this. And, because of course it means that somebody has to give up power to include women. And so what we find, and this is really important, I think, to emphasize, is that including women has not had negative effects. It might take a little bit longer, right? Might be more complicated. We talked about this briefly. But that's really, really important. So the other thing that women do when they are in these processes is that they also push for inclusion of others, sort of minoritized others, indigenous peoples, and so forth. So women kind of, just including women is not necessarily just about women's issues, which brings me to one more point related to this, which is that just putting in gender inclusive language does not do the trick. Okay, so that's also important. So we actually need women and women's movement to carry this message. So then who are these women becomes a really important question. Where are they drawn from? Do they have a long history of being engaged in these issues? Do they have a base in society? Research from beyond the immediate peace process finds that the longer term effects of including women in, for example, constitution building or elections and so forth, hold much better if we are actually supporting them with a strong women's movements beyond the immediate, sort of inclusion in negotiations. So I think part of the question here is who are the women that are being included? We have seen sort of an NGOization, meaning that there are certain kinds of women who get included, but they're not necessarily connected to the grassroots. Now, to be able to meaningfully include women, we have to also make sure that the sort of broader economic and security situation for the women is given. One of the things that happens when women become more prominent because they're part of these political processes is that they also become targets, right? So, and that produces a conundrum where we have, we obviously want to include them, but do we want to put a target on their back and make their situation even more difficult? And also a question of a little bit, where are we in the timeline of the conflict, right? When women are dealing literally with where's my next meal going to come from, they're probably not going to have time to sort of think about the broader issues. So that's a lot to start with. I think I will hand over and then we can have more discussion.
Yes, thank you. There were many thoughts that came up, so we will have a conversation. But first, Annika, I would like you to... You've had this, it's been a priority, obviously, for the Swedish feminist foreign policy for 5 years now. And so please tell us, how have you talked about this? Can you see any results? What would you like to see more of? Well,
Thank you. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda turns 20 next year. And if we look back 20 years, we can see that the progress has been tremendously slow. And that is why we, when we came onto the Security Council of the United Nations, decided to make this a priority also in the dealings with the mandates for UN peace missions and UN negotiators. And on paper, we have been very successful. Almost all mandates and resolutions now contain the role of women as victims, but maybe more importantly, also as actors. The problem is, of course, how will this actually change the situation on the ground? And there we still have a lot to do. In the UN family, there's very little reporting on the situation of women. We also know that women that are active or trying to be active in peace processes, they don't know. I have only one example. When our UN ambassador went to Mali, a few women's groups came up to him to tell him, thank you for the wonderful resolution that you have produced. Now we have a better chance to be represented at the table. So I think we have to start by recognizing how difficult this is. And we also need to recognize that lately, let's say the last 5 years, this is also a headwind issue where women's issues generally, LGBT issues as well, are in a situation where we have more and more resistance from authoritarian men and leaders. So it's even more important to try to work also concretely, but also normatively and principally on this. So our policy, our feminist foreign policy builds on rights, resources, and representation. And I believe those 3 R's are very relevant also for the area of women, peace and security and women at the table, because it's a right, it's a matter of representation and representativity, which is complicated, as Anniken said, but it's also about resourcing women to be good actors at the table, and I will come back to that. Then, of course, a peace agreement that does not take into consideration economic and social issues and development will not last, that's for sure. And maybe, as Anniken said, women and young people are better at putting those issues on the negotiation table. We talk a lot about inclusivity, and this has become a buzzword. No matter that, it's very important that different voices are heard, that the processes are as inclusive as possible, that they deal with all the levels in a conflict. But we have a long way to go there, despite the Security Council resolutions. So the question is now, how do we make this happen more? And I would say 2 things that work. And one of them is closely related to the work of civil society organizations in the field. And that is to help to organize women. And then it's a challenge for the civil society organizations that are engaging in this to look after the representativity issue, that we do not bring the token women, so to say, so that everyone can see there is a woman at the table, or that you only bring the elite. And this is, of course, very, very difficult in societies that are very often traditional, where in the society that is being destroyed by conflict, you have traditional thinking and norms that would make it even more cumbersome for the leaders of or the facilitators of the negotiation to bring women to the table. But nevertheless, what I have seen over the last 5 years is that can play a very important role, and I'll give some examples. In Syria, for example, many are engaged. It's a very tricky situation where women are not necessarily against Assad, to put it very simply. We all believe that sustainable peace may not be including the Assad regime. At the same time, there are representatives of the Assad regime. Do we want women to come in there so that the negotiations that the UN envoy that he's conducting, that they will be representative? This issue has been stuck now for 14 months. We urged him to bring women to the committee that he's forming. Still, this is such a sticky issue that this committee has not been able to meet. But many activities are ongoing with men and women in various quarters, supported by the EU, by us, by many civil society organizations. And this will, of course, give hope for the future when Syria will hopefully be rebuilt in such a way that we have more of a democratic society. You remember the peace negotiations on Yemen, that human and humanitarian disaster that we had in Rimbo. It's called Stockholm internationally, but we call it Rimbo. That envoy was not really able to bring women to the delegations of the 2 parties. So he formed an advisory group of knowledgeable women from Syria in exile and from the inside of Syria with technical expertise. And he made them shuttle between the 2 negotiation teams in Rimbo to bring the issues where they had knowledge to the center of the negotiation. This is still very, very early, but that's a way to solve it, even if they are not at the table. There was a seminar I just came in when it was finalizing about Afghanistan. I believe it's very worrisome that we may end up in a situation where the role of women has been improved in this very slow peace process in Afghanistan, but with talks between the US and the Taliban, we may lose the momentum that the present government of Afghanistan has recognized as an important one. And there I believe many of us can also play a role to support women in this difficult situation. what we are doing through the Women's Mediation Network that we set up 4 years ago is that we are supporting local mediation in Afghanistan to give the tools to women to resolve local conflict, also with the hope that this will not trickle down but climb up as important factors in the hopefully improved process if women are still kept on the agenda. If that is not the case, I don't know really what will happen to Afghanistan. When it comes coming back to the UN, we have work to do. Germany, who is now on the Security Council, promised to take this further. They're doing a good job, but they had a major backlash in April where the issue of sexual reproductive health and rights was actually brought out of a Security Council resolution for the first time in many, many years. And that is why I say that we are really working against the tide presently. We will also, of course, continue to work with all the entities that are active in the field to have more women than the women in Mali say that this resolution is actually helpful to us. Then we have job to do in the European Union and its external activities. I think the European Union is actually lagging behind. Even the African Union, they have moved ahead fairly quickly, including with the sub-regional organizations in Africa. There's also the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, where all the women ambassadors, they are about 1/3 of the ambassadors, have taken an initiative to move the women, peace and security agenda also normatively in the discussions in OSCE, but also in their field missions. So when people say there are no women, they are wrong, because there will always be skillful women that can step into the negotiations.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Linda, I will let you pick up on this one and go ahead.
Thank you. I will try to build on the academic and policy frame that we got from Annika and Annika. And for those of you who don't know, Kvinna started in 1993 during the war in the Balkans. So we have experienced the birth of UN Resolution 1325. We have supported the women's movement through the various peace processes and the Dayton Agreement, which did not include women in Bosnia. And we try to really work, just like you say, to strengthen the society, the civil society, the women's rights organizations, and at the same time work on policy level, work to ensure and to include women at the peace negotiation table. I wanted to be concrete. We'll try to be as concrete as possible. It's not easy. But we have a quite recent agreement in Kvinna to Kvinna. In 2016-17, we, with support of the Swedish government and the Canadian government, two governments who actually have a feminist foreign policy, were given support because we don't have all ourselves, we need resources to do so, gave support to the Women's Advisory Committee, to back then the higher committee, negotiation committee of the Syrian opposition, the HNC. So during 2 years, we were given support to WAC, I will call it WAC, to make sure that they had a role in the Geneva talks. WAC comprised of 14 women from various walks of life in Syria, but they were expected to all agree. I can tell you they did not. 3 of them were also at the negotiation table. So they were having double roles because they were advisors and negotiators. And that was a big discussion that we had. They were also there as experts. They were experts in public policy, in international law, in constitution building, in litigation, local governance, and peace building. They were not just experts on women's issues. I think this is important, and we brought that up over and over again for them to give technical expertise into the various baskets that were being negotiated. However, as you know, in November 2017, a new opposition body was formed, and the SNC replaced the HNC. And without a formal relationship, the Women's Advisory Committee was dissolved, and our support to them, of course. So during this time when we supported them, what did we learn from these 2 years, and what support were we as a Swedish women's rights organization able to give? We gave knowledge and exchange, opportunities to exchange with other women in other conflict areas such as Yemen. We gave a lot of logistic support. We facilitated access and the various connections. And we also gave emotional support. And emotional support came out as very crucial and important when we evaluated our support to WAC. And this is rarely spoken about, but I think this is really important because just like you mentioned, it's an ongoing war and these women carry a big burden. And I also want to stop 2 seconds when you hear logistical support. What does that actually mean? It doesn't sound very exciting. But to enable women to participate in Geneva talks, you would not imagine the hoops and the loops that we had to jump to make that happen. I mean, you know, the visa constrictions that we have globally, that includes these women, to enable them to travel to Geneva. Also to enable them to have a role, because the majority of them were not on the negotiation table. Which hotels should they stay at when they were in Geneva? Might not sound exciting to you, but crucial and vital and super important. And we managed to, during the talks in Geneva and in between the talks, facilitate talks and meetings with external stakeholders, which was very, very important and crucial to also leverage importance to this group of women and also to enable public diplomacy. And I would say that we, as Kvinna to Kvinna, believing so strongly in building a women's movement, had super high expectations on ourselves and on this group of women. And our experience and what we wanted to do is exactly this. We wanted to build a link between the constituencies and the grassroots women's organizations and women's movement on the ground and these women. Because the question will always be, who are these women and why are they there? We did so. We did terrible, but we also did not achieve the high goals and ambitions that we had, I must say. So we learned, I would say 3 things that we learned that really shows, and I feel like I'm washing my dirty laundry here because we want to say we're the best, right? And say that this is perfect. And it's not, but it's important. And even though we learned from our failures, I want to share them. Is that, you know, the bridge that we want to build between track 1 diplomacy negotiation table and the grassroots is hard. It's super hard. And it doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. And they are being questioned. The civil society will ask, who are these women? And these women will say, well, I speak to other women. And the men will obviously say, why are they there? They know nothing. So that is hard, but yet important. The second one will come as a shocker to you. Women do not agree just because they're women. But the expectation that they do is high. And the last one is exactly what you spoke about. In which role do we support women? During the Geneva talks, you had 2 advisory committees. And the question is, what do you do with an advice? Why are women giving the role of being advisors? I'll stop there for now.
Okay, thank you very much. And so this is a concrete example of Syria, who's a very, what's so-called hot conflict, and it was very much in the eye of the international community. But at Kvinna, we also work, for example, in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the conflict about Nagorno-Karabakh. And we have just recently published a study about that, looking into the consequences of that so-called cold war or frozen conflict on the women. And there were a lot of interesting things that came up, but one of them, and it relates to what you also said, the NGOization of women, that when we talked to them, because they did a lot of peace building work, they did it within their communities, but we actually have, through an EU-funded project, managed to get women for many years from Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Nagorno-Karabakh to come together and meet. But they did not see their work as peace building. It had become as if peace building was something, a profession, that you have to have an education to do. So they really kind of shunned away when we were like, well, that is peace building. They're like, no, we don't do that. And they also would say talked their own role and their own lives down, which was really, really saddening to read, when they were always like, well, I could die any day, but my life is not important. It's, it's my husband, it's my son, it's my brother. They are the important ones. So we have, it's a lot of steps on this ladder of also making women understand that their experiences are really valuable, and the work that they do every day in their communities is peace building as well. So and it's not only in this very hot conflict, it is in these frozen conflicts, which they of course didn't agree on, that it was a frozen conflict. For them it was very present in their everyday life. But I would like to ask, I guess, one question for you, Annick, about, because you said that it's, we know that including women does not give negative effects, but then I was a little curious about the Colombia and the talk about that we brought, that it was the gendered language in there that has, made it more difficult, and your reflections on that. And then I have a question for you, Annika, after that.
Yes. So what I was referring to is in terms of eventually reaching the agreement, right? Which happened. So that's when it's, we haven't seen like a negative effect when women have been included. Now, does it make the process harder? It definitely can make the process a lot harder. And Colombia is an interesting example. There's actually a lot of good research also accompanying this. And there's, research also pointing out that, the quite strong, actually, feminist movement and women's movements involvement actually isn't quite happy. They don't think it went far enough, right? So I think that it's actually a fairly to me it seems, and others can, it's a fairly healthy process that is happening, and it's one of the places where we have sort of long-term research. We have enough attention also to this question of reporting, which you brought up, which is this, do we track what happens, after the agreement has been put into place? Because one of the things is we often focus on, do we get an agreement? And then we just kind of go like, okay, bye, I'll go and do other things. But we really have to be better about making sure along the way that we're still tracking, we're supporting the sort of implementation and all of this. So to clarify, that it was more about, do we get to the agreement? Have talks broken down simply because we've included women? And somebody can correct me, but as far as I know, that hasn't been the case. No. So that would be
But on that same theme then, you said when it came to Yemen, it seemed like the one thing they could agree on was that they didn't want women at the table, which is so ironic and annoying. So it's,
Not really.
No,
they
it wasn't.
didn't bring any women. One of the delegations had one woman.
Okay.
But so there was not an agreement of not having women.
Okay, because otherwise sometimes it feels like that. That is like, if there's one thing that, men in power can agree on, is that we can do this, So that is my question. Coming then, from civil society, it seems like you in government have all the power, and it's, you should be able to just tell them, well, if you want our help and support, you have to include women. But obviously, it's not that easy, So do you need more allies? Who should we talk to? Come on. how hard can it be, to put your foot down? What happens behind those doors? Why is it so hard?
As I said before, many of the conflicts, both frozen and active, take place in societies where women do not necessarily have not played a role in society, even if they exactly play the role that you were both talking about, keeping their societies together. So the dilemma that the envoy to Libya for the UN described to me just 10 days ago was, how do I do this? Do I force the parties in Libya to bring women to the table and then risk further armed hostilities, because that's the situation in Libya. It's not only lagging the peace process, but it's actually having more armed conflict. And of course, there's no obvious answer to that question. If we want a ceasefire in Libya, how do we then deal with the women? Then I'm sure that women on both sides would be more supportive of a ceasefire than men in Libya, bearing in mind that society. But there is no clear answer. And then what do we do in general? We have to persist. We have to talk about this. We have to reach others than young men and women, and make it obvious to everyone that, as Annick said, this is not negative for a peace process, and make the argument that this is actually conducive to sustainable peace. But this is confrontative, and as I said before, it's an upstream battle these days, and many men feel strengthened today with the sort of zero-sum approach that many leaders take, and they believe that a military victory is more likely than it was before. And to add to this, since I follow several conflicts very closely, Venezuela, Yemen, North Korea, you have a whole group of countries surrounding the conflict that have interests, material or power-related or both. They couldn't care less about women. So it's not only about talking to the men that possibly can form part of a negotiation delegation, but it's also about all the superpowers and regional powers that do not really have an interest. If I take North Korea, since this is a topical, on the North Korean side, there is a woman in the team. It's sort of my opposite number, but I am not sure that she brings different approaches to the negotiations between North Korea and the United States. So that is why I also talk about the token woman. It's not necessarily that. There are also men that fully understand the importance of bringing women to the table. So what we've said before, track 2 activities, link them up to government so that they side governments or involved actors so that they understand the importance of this. Because track 2 can be almost a profession. Yeah. It's important that it gets an importance also in the track 1 activities. And we need to persist as a government, but we cannot do that without the voice of many others. And I'm really happy that we now have Canada, France, Tunisia, and very likely also Spain, declaring soon a feminist foreign policy with all of that, what that entails also when it comes to responsibility in peace processes.
Yeah, and that is something that we've said so many times when we talk to our partners, how much they appreciate and just using, we say usually that don't use words, but do action. But by using this word, feminist and foreign policy, that is action in itself and really important, an amazing result in spreading this. Okay, so we have a few minutes for questions or comments, and maybe Robert, would you like to do a reflection from the floor?
Others a voice.
Others a voice. Okay. Does anyone? No? Yes? Please introduce yourself as well.
Hello, I'm Anki Sjöberg from Fight for Humanity. So first of all, thanks for a very thought-provoking panel. Just briefly on Colombia, because we followed that process quite closely and also working with the FARC women. I think their gender was one of the many aspects that was used basically because the peace agreement was very unpopular. And I think really there we need to think more long-term and work more like with the image of the combatants. I think FARC made many miscalculations in terms of how they were perceived by society. And I think they didn't realize that this was very much a vote against them, basically. So gender was somehow mobilized and used by some actors, but it was not the main point to my view. Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree with that. After 50 years of conflict in Colombia, there was no trust, and there were groups that did not at all want this peace. I'm sure that the way we approached it, in Norway, we supported the gender aspect, so if someone is to blame, it's Sweden. That approach will prove to be the long-term solution, I'm convinced. But there are losers, and they also have external support.
Yes, of course. Is there anyone else in the audience?
I could also say something to this, which is one of the questions that comes into play in Colombia is the fact that it was put to a vote, right? So, you know, that's another thing we might want to think about, like, is that a good idea? I mean, the idea is that it gives more legitimacy, but it can also produce the kind of problems that we have seen in Colombia, right? So sometimes that's, even though it might seem like the democratic thing to do with everything that we know about how these kind of things can be influenced, it can be really difficult. So that's another part of the package, yeah.
Okay. Quiet audience. Or maybe you said it all. Okay, so that Robert, please. And introduce yourself as well.
Thank you very much. I'm Robert Egnell, Vice Chancellor of the Defense University. Thanks so much for the panel. We have a lack of data and there's a chicken and egg kind of situation, but are there any serious attempt of improving this data? There are a number of cases out there. Are they being properly researched? Are you given access by the political leaders in these negotiations, for example? Do you think we'll have more data in 5 years?
I think he's asking me. Yes. Okay. Yes, but the academic answer. So there is more research happening. The question, I think, partly needs to be answered with a conversation about data and what kind of data we are talking about. There's it's sort of the long-term, in-depth kind of studies that I was mentioning with regard to Colombia, for example. These are often sort of qualitative, sort of deep-level case studies that really look at the process in terms of the larger historical context and the regional context. When we are talking about data in terms of quantitative data, right, so that we can say 3% of this or 30% of this kind of data is much harder to collect on these kind of processes, because so much is, you know, sort of like nobody's going to go on the record, right, if they're in these kind of, you know, track 1, track 2 negotiations and say this is exactly what happened, because that's not part of the process. So we have sort of this question of what kind of data do we think is relevant data, and I happen to think that these broader, in-depth case study, qualitative studies, which we are seeing a lot more. And I am just going to throw out a little bit of a plug for a journal I'm involved in, which is the International Feminist Journal of Politics, which publishes a lot of this work. That kind of in-depth case study is actually giving us a lot of information. Now the question is, how do we translate this so that it becomes useful also for policymakers and for actors like Kvinna to make the case more successfully. And I think that's kind of where I think we are having a little bit of an issue, right? How do we translate the sort of more, book-length academic work into talking points that can be helpful? So, yeah, that's where I would put some of this. And of course, always need resources to do all this work. So.
Okay, so I take that as a yes. You think there will be more research? So
yes, I think there already is a lot of research. It's a matter of making sure that it gets to the right
so
places,
then I'll leave the final word to you, Annika. Do you think that we will continue to see progress in the policy area, like you just mentioned, all of these countries becoming having a feminist foreign policy as well? You think we're going in the right direction?
Yes, I think so.
Yes.
I hope so. But I also believe we will have more polarization globally, maybe in Europe as well, and in the discussions on how to move from armed conflict to peace process. But one thing strikes me now that I believe is important, and that supports a more positive vision. I've heard several facilitators, negotiators representing mainly the UN, describe how they work with various track 2 activities, NGOs, think tanks, to build up for their track 1 activity. And there is even a policy brief on this written by the former head of the UN political department that I just read the other day. So that's very hopeful, and that can, of course, be further encouraged. Then, of course, women is a key actor here, but there are also other groups that can become involved. So I said my 3 R's in the beginning, rights, resources, and representation. I wanted to add 3 R's. That what we also need is results. Reality check, which is actually what I said about this one organization having realized what we were doing in the Security Council. And the third one is research.
Research. What a perfect ending. Thank you so much. Ta-da.